There we go. Hi,
Perfect.
my name is Samantha Casey, and my presentation is called The Neuroscientific, Sociological, and Practical Analyses of Boston's Opioid Use Patterns. So for a little bit of context, opioids are a class of drugs that include substances like heroin, fentanyl, oxycodone, hydrocodone, things like that. These can be naturally derived or they can be synthetic, created in a lab. Opioid use has existed for a very long time, but a pretty recent turning point in opioid use came with the approval of OxyContin in 1996, which was followed by a very aggressive marketing campaign by Purdue Pharma. This image on the right-hand side shows the number of opioid deaths per year from 1999 to 2019 throughout the United States. And this graph shows that almost 500,000 people have died from overdoses involving opioids in some capacity during that time, and that number is increasing every day. So getting into the methodology of my presentation, there are three main parts to the research that I did for this project. The first part of this is the neuroscience. At its core, substance use is a biological phenomenon, so I completed a literature review about what is known on opioid use, on substance use disorders, on medication-assisted treatment. The second part of this was looking at the sociology behind substance use, looking at the epidemiology of this issue as it pertains to cities, and then looking at socioeconomic status and inequality specifically in Boston, which was my focus for this research. I also completed an analysis of certain turning points and certain events related to drug use in this city. Finally, I looked at the practice of harm reduction movements and strategies, as well as the practice that organizations doing work in Boston are completing. I did a number of interviews with people who work in this field, people who work with people who use drugs. My central question for this research was, how can we use these two disciplines of neuroscience and sociology in conjunction with these practical strategies to better understand opioid use and consider the best practices to keep people safe? And what exactly does safety mean? So looking at the neuroscience of opioid use, opioids are very often prescribed for analgesia and pain relief because there are opioid receptors in the brain that respond to pain. Opioids also modulate the pathway for reward and pleasure, which is highlighted in this image on the right-hand side. And the takeaway from this is that many brain areas are implicated. So while people might take opioids for pain relief, they can also feel some sort of pleasure, some sort of reward, and that is what prompts people to use these substances in a way that isn't prescribed. Moving into the sociology, drug use is very often treated as an act of social deviance. And when someone participates in an act of social deviance, they receive sanctions. For a lot of people, this involves incarceration. For others, this involves rehabilitation. When talking about this issue, it's really important to recognize that the criminalization of drugs is very explicitly tied to race and class. Drug policy is and has been racist, and the epidemic status of opioid use came with an increase in white deaths. It's also important to consider the way in which blame differs by race. Drug use and repeated drug use has historically been seen as a moral failure, and this public narrative is very slowly shifting towards recognizing that it is a biological phenomenon and it is reflective of someone's moral status. However, the shift came with white people being impacted more, and it's important to recognize what that means when considering how to move forward. Looking at Boston specifically, Massachusetts Avenue at Melnia Cass Boulevard is seen as somewhat of an epicenter for opioid use and homelessness. And while these two groups are distinct, there is a significant overlap. There are a number of shelters and services in this general area, including Boston Medical Center, needle exchanges, things like that. And it is important to recognize that these services are operating at reduced capacities due to COVID, which has implications for the people who are accessing these services. One event that I wanted to highlight occurred a couple summers ago, which was referred to as Operation Clean Sweep, in which Boston city officials went to Mass Ave and Melnia Cass and picked everything up off of the sidewalk, including people's belongings. The image on the right-hand side was taken the night Operation Clean Sweep began, and people's wheelchairs were removed from underneath them and thrown into a dumpster. Another event I want to highlight relates to the Long Island Shelter, which was located in Boston Harbor and accessible by a bridge in that red circle. There were about 1,000 beds here, and this made this the largest shelter in Boston. In October of 2014, the bridge connecting Long Island to the mainland was condemned, and staff and all clients had 3 hours to evacuate before the bridge was shut down and eventually demolished. 476 emergency beds were created day of, but this does not account for the 500 beds that were specifically designated for substance use. This is a figure detailing the opioid-related overdose deaths in Massachusetts from 2000 to 2019. And this red line marks the closure of the Long Island shelter. So it's important to consider what this meant for substance use in the city, considering how we got here today. The last part of this is looking at harm reduction. So this is from the National Harm Reduction Coalition's website, but harm reduction refers to two things. One of this is the act of reducing harm. So these are the practical strategies that are associated with mitigating the negative consequences that come with using drugs. So this isn't meant to say that there are no consequences. It's doing what's possible to limit the damage that is associated with using drugs. Harm reduction also refers to a movement for social justice, which, according to the National Harm Reduction Coalition, is built on a belief in and respect for the rights of people who use drugs. So the phrase harm reduction can refer to those two things. Harm reduction in practice looks like a lot of different things. One of these looks like overdose prevention and response. So looking at, training on how to respond to overdose, how to recognize an overdose, and how to say administer Narcan or naloxone. This is an overdose reversal medicine. It's available for free in a lot of different areas throughout Massachusetts. And I do want to flag that you can do Narcan training online. It is very accessible and it's a really important skill to learn. Harm reduction also looks like providing safer use supplies, such as sterile needles. It looks like providing access to healthcare, like STI testing, and it looks like advocating for safe injection facilities. Safe injection facilities are very often seen as controversial because some people will assert that it provides a space for people to use drugs, but people are always going to use drugs, so providing them with a space in which they can access medical assistance if needed will save lives. There are a lot of really excellent organizations in Boston working with people who use drugs and ensuring that they're safe. They range from organizations that provide healthcare, provide supplies, provide any sort of support. They also include legislative advocacy organizations. So the last thing I want to talk about is the stigma that's associated with drug use, and specifically with opioid use, and how we can kind of unpack that, because that is the way to move forward in saving lives and making harm reduction more accessible to people. So one way we can do this is simply making services more accessible to everyone. There are a lot of people who have been denied services in the past or who face additional barriers to services today. So it's important to consider how we might be able to fix that, how we might be able to remove those barriers, and how we might be able to make services accessible. Another thing to think about is the language that we use every day to talk about people who use drugs and the act of using drugs. How can this language be stigmatizing, and how can we shift it? A lot of the times, Mass Avenue at Melnia Cass Boulevard will be referred to as Methadone Mile. What does this say about the people who access services there? What does this say about the area? When we congratulate someone on getting clean, what does that mean when they do use drugs? What does that mean for people who are still using drugs? It's also important to move forward with reframing the issue of substance use as a very complex biological phenomenon influenced by social factors. It is not a marking of personal failure, and it's important to continue that trend forward and recognizing and acknowledging that. Finally, it's important to understand that there are a lot of ways to navigate substance use. Treatment means different things for everyone. One core factor of harm reduction is meeting people where they're at. That means something different for every single person. Finally, I want to leave with these three main ideas. Providing service and safety for people who use drugs is an act of care and empowerment. It saves lives. Second, people are always going to use drugs, and that's okay. My goal here isn't to stop opioid use forever. It's thinking about how we can make it safer for people, how we can save the lives of people in our community who might be using drugs. And finally, harm reduction as a concept saves lives, and it should be implemented as much as possible. Thank you very much.